All right, in this video, we are going to look at how to use an if statement in T-SQL. And we are going to do this with the sys tables. And so first of all, I'm declaring two variables because we are going to be using this in a nested if, and actually a three nested if, which in general I wouldn't recommend that, but it's definitely an example that I want to show you what we can do with all of this. So the first thing, I'm pulling the table name and the schema ID. That way we can look at the table name and the schema ID and we can see why we're going to get certain results. Second one that I'm doing here is I'm just doing the 1 equals 1, which is pretty standard with T-SQL as a check. That should be true. This should be false. 1 equals 2 should always be false. And then I'm also showing that we can do strings with these if statements. We can do the like function. So for instance, I have only RNA and I look at like RNA with the % at the beginning. So we see that's correct, but there's no DNA. So of course that will return no, and that's what we expect. We have RNA yes, DNA no. We see 1 equals 1, Saxon math, 1 equals 2, Common Core. All right, and so now we start getting into the actual table names. So now we're going to apply this on columns. And this is just kind of experimental purposes to test ifs, just for those of you who are looking at that. So when we look for a table name like health check, we see that there's actually only one table name, and we see it comes back as yes, that is correct. However, the other table name, remember, is health checks. So of course that one comes back as no here, which is what we would expect. So when we do that % sign at the end, just like we would do when we were checking if something is like something, we'll notice that both of them come back as yes. So that definitely works. Now we get into nested ifs, and I just have one example of two nested ifs, because generally 3 is going to be a little bit more complicated, and so 2 will be pretty easy to understand. But what we're seeing here is we're looking at if the name is like the health check, and if the schema ID is 7, then we'll do yes, otherwise no. So what we're seeing is we're putting the nested if in the yes clause here, because we're seeing if it is like the health check, and if it's under this schema, right? So keep that in mind if you wanted to do it in the no case, right? So if you didn't want to know something, let's say you were ignoring the yes, let's say if the table name was like health check and you actually wanted to know, let's say if you were trying to skip that without using a not like, you could do like health check, and then you could put your next if clause in the no statement as opposed to putting it into the if. You could just say yes, and then you could put in your no clause what you were checking for, maybe a different schema. Okay, now in the third, or the last two examples, I said third because we have two nested ifs within an if statement. We have two variables up here. One is y1 and one is y2. So y2, user table, we know that the type descending is going to be user table if it's a user table, and y1 shouldn't come back because this is just too many if statements. That's definitely not something that should ever come back, not in systables at least. So we first of all check if the table is like health check. That would be, there's one table that is, as we see. So we know because we tried here, we know it actually tried to a check. It also hits the schema ID, which is also true. So in that true statement, we then check if the type descending equals y1, and if it does, we say yes. If it doesn't, we say it tried. So again, we're still putting it in the yes clauses in these if statements, right? And so we see it tried, or we tried, I'm sorry. And keep in mind that if it had failed earlier, let's say that we had schema ID 2, right? It would have failed at the second part. So while it would have been in this health check, though, we wouldn't have known because of the no and the no. But while it would have passed the health check, this like here, it would not have passed the schema if we had that quality. So keep that in mind, even though I'm doing the yes and no here mostly. For the most part, if you are looking for if statements this way, you probably will have different statements that you say for your no. So for instance, we might put, let's say, no 1 in the first no and no 2 in the second no to differentiate them. And then, of course, finally, we do use the user table, so we should get back a yes, and that is exactly what we get back, is that yes. So this is just a demonstration of if statements. You can see that we can use any type of, a lot of types of syntax, I should see. What we're doing is we're checking if something is true or false, and we see that we can, if something is true or false, we can then put another if statement and then another if statement. Now keep in mind that just because we can do something doesn't mean that's the most readable or the best thing to do. So that may not be the best practice in your environment. And it is funny how many people can kind of whack their head against the wall if there's too many nested ifs. So don't do this in a manner that drives other people crazy.